property, exercising their culture. With every day that passes, the risk of irreparable harm to those rights grows greater. In conclusion, Madam President, Azerbaijan, whose president boasted of driving ethnic Armenians out of Nagorno-Karabakh like dogs, now asks this court to trust it to protect those very people, people against whom it has committed numerous atrocities, whose cultural heritage it seeks to erase, whose language it says should never be spoken. It has starved these people into submission for the past 9 months, and now it claims to have their best interests at heart. The Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh need more than Azerbaijan's hollow assurances. They need the protection of this court. They need it today, not in a few years' time. If events are simply left to unfold, then judging from Azerbaijan's conduct to date, the right to return and all that goes with it will be worthless by the time you decide this case on the merits. By that time, the ethnic cleansing of Nagorno-Karabakh will be set in stone. But that does not need to be how this story ends. The Court's provisional measures jurisdiction plays a vital role in ensuring that justice does not come too late. We urge you to exercise it. Madam President, this concludes my presentation. I thank the Court for its attention and respectfully request that you invite Professor Murphy to take the floor.
I thank Ms. MacDonald for her statement, and I now invite Professor Sean Murphy to take the floor. You have the floor, Professor.
Thank you, Madam President. It's a great honor to appear again before this court on behalf of the Republic of Armenia. Madam President, members of the court, we have addressed this morning the essential facts underlying Armenia's request for provisional measures and explained why the court's legal standard for issuing such measures has been met. My task is to explain why Armenia's first 9 requests are all necessary to preserve the rights of ethnic Armenians under the CERD, leaving to my colleague, Professor Darjan, to explain why the 10th measure is equally necessary. I will conclude by explaining why issuance of these measures would not require the court to resolve any facts prejudicial to a decision on jurisdiction or on the merits in this case. The members of the court may wish to refer to tab 2 in your judge's folder, where you will find the 10 measures that Armenia requests. The first measure is that Azerbaijan shall refrain from taking any measures which might entail breaches of its obligations under the CERD. This broad measure does not seek to address a specific type of conduct, but it is warranted given the diversity of Azerbaijan's acts since 19 September 2023, which have severely jeopardized the CERD rights of ethnic Armenians. The second measure we request is that Azerbaijan shall refrain from taking any actions aimed at or having the effect of, first, displacing the remaining ethnic Armenians from Nagorno-Karabakh, second, preventing displaced persons from returning to their homes in Nagorno-Karabakh, or third, preventing those who wish to leave Nagorno-Karabakh from doing so. This measure is in essence about the freedom of movement of ethnic Armenians in relation to Nagorno-Karabakh. The court has ordered similar measures in the past, including in the Georgia v. Russia CERD case, where it ordered that the government controlling territory must ensure to the local citizens of that state the right of persons to freedom of movement and residence within the border of the state. As we have noted, Azerbaijan has already taken numerous adverse steps that have promoted the displacement of ethnic Armenians and prevented their return. As Mr. Martin explained, following the 9-month-long blockade that caused a humanitarian crisis in Nagorno-Karabakh, Azerbaijan attacked the enclave, targeting numerous civilian structures, including homes and schools. That attack, combined with the fear of inevitable atrocities that would follow, and with the history of extreme discrimination against ethnic Armenians, forced the displacement of more than 100,000 ethnic Armenians residing in Nagorno-Karabakh at the time of the attack, including more than 30,000 children. Azerbaijan must be ordered to refrain from any such conduct in the future. At the same time, Azerbaijan has not taken meaningful steps to allow any possibility of return. Azerbaijan assures us that it will afford ethnic Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh all rights and freedoms in line with its constitution and relevant international human rights mechanisms. Yet, in this context, such vague assurances are simply not enough to bring about the necessary conditions for the return of ethnic Armenians, given the long-standing and well-documented hatred towards them, and given the lack of any concrete assurances, such as that civilians will not be prosecuted if they return, that ethnic Armenians will enjoy meaningful political representation, that homes which were destroyed will be rebuilt or repaired, or that those homes remaining intact will not be reassigned to Azerbaijanis. Moreover, a promise of reintegration does not respect Nagorno-Karabakh's unique historic status, including as an autonomous oblast within the Soviet Union. To the contrary, President Aliyev has promised that, and I quote, Armenians living in Karabakh will have no status, no independence, and no special privilege, end of quote. Azerbaijan's vague assurances and unhelpful promises also ring hollow in the face of Azerbaijan's continuing conduct on the ground, such as threatening Armenian cultural heritage in areas newly under Azerbaijan's control. In short, Azerbaijan also must be ordered to refrain from actions that prevent the safe and expeditious return of those who have been displaced. And of course, future steps by Azerbaijan must also allow any ethnic Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh to leave if they are able and willing to do so. The third measure we request is that Azerbaijan shall withdraw all military and law enforcement personnel from all civilian establishments in Nagorno-Karabakh occupied as a result of its armed attack on 19 September 2023. The court will note that we are only requesting that Azerbaijan military and law enforcement personnel withdraw from civilian establishments that they have now occupied in Nagorno-Karabakh, meaning withdraw from establishments that are not military or that are not law enforcement installations. This request is intimately related to the circumstances that led to the massive displacement of ethnic Armenians and any possibility for their return. Unless such personnel are withdrawn from civilian establishments of Nagorno-Karabakh to include its residential communities, civic buildings, schools, medical facilities, and places of worship. Ethnic Armenian civilians, all too familiar with the past atrocities committed by Azerbaijani government personnel, will continue to feel afraid of living in or returning to Nagorno-Karabakh. Indeed, reports and videos have now emerged of Azerbaijani personnel shooting at civilian homes, ransacking those homes, and looting private belongings. These being the same military personnel previously seen on video and in photographs beheading, torturing, and otherwise abusing ethnic Armenians. And sadly, these are the same military personnel that instead of being prosecuted by Azerbaijan, are rewarded and their acts glorified. The fourth measure we request is that Azerbaijan refrain from impeding the access of the United Nations to the ethnic Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh, or otherwise interfering in UN activities. The only way to guarantee that ethnic Armenians will feel safe in returning to and remaining in Nagorno-Karabakh is for a UN monitoring mission to be granted ongoing, unfettered, and unimpeded access to the entirety of the region and to the ethnic Armenian community found there. Moreover, such a mission should include representatives from UNESCO, which Azerbaijan has previously blocked from visiting Armenian cultural sites. In fact, as you have heard, a proposal for such a UN monitoring mission has received wide support from the international community over the past 2 weeks. But as Ms. McDonald has explained, Azerbaijan has failed to commit to it. Azerbaijan this afternoon will surely make much of its consent since the September attack to a very limited and very brief access to Nagorno-Karabakh by a few UN personnel. But as Mr. Martin noted, a limited scope, one-day visit is not the type of UN mission that the international community insists is required. To ensure full protection of the rights of ethnic Armenians under the CERD, what is needed is an ongoing and unhindered UN mission, one that is staffed with human rights experts, and that is allowed full transparency as to what is happening in the region. The fifth measure that we request is that Azerbaijan likewise refrain from taking any steps that impede humanitarian assistance by the ICRC to ethnic Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh, and instead that Azerbaijan actively cooperate with the ICRC to that end. As Ms. McDonald indicated, the ICRC plays a pivotal role in 3 key areas. First, ensuring that the few ethnic Armenians remaining in Nagorno-Karabakh are located, provided for, and if needed, transported to Armenia for safety. Second, the ICRC is critical for finding persons and retrieving the remains of deceased individuals. And third, the ICRC is essential for visiting detained Armenians in Azerbaijan, which thus far it has not been permitted to do. Indeed, Azerbaijan has a demonstrated practice of impeding the work of the ICRC, including during the aftermath of the 2020 war, when it hindered ICRC's access to detained civilians and POWs, and more recently when it impeded the ICRC from transporting humanitarian aid to Nagorno-Karabakh. Azerbaijan even kidnapped ethnic Armenians who were being transported by the ICRC to Armenia during the blockade. Given this history, while there is some evidence of limited ICRC access to Nagorno-Karabakh today, an unequivocal measure from the court on this issue is essential. The sixth measure that we request is that Azerbaijan immediately restore public utilities to Nagorno-Karabakh and refrain from disrupting them in the future. As Mr. Martin noted, the ethnic Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh were exposed to darkness and frigid temperatures for months as Azerbaijan interrupted and at times completely suspended the provision of gas and electricity to Armenia, from Armenia to the region. While supply of both gas and electricity to the region has begun to be restored, the electricity and the gas pipelines are now supplied from Azerbaijan and not from Armenia. Thus, Azerbaijan now has complete control over the provision of these public utilities to Nagorno-Karabakh, and yet there is nothing to assure ethnic Armenians that Azerbaijan will not once again arbitrarily cut them off. Consequently, this measure is also critical. The seventh measure we request is that Azerbaijan refrain from taking punitive actions against the current or former political representatives of Nagorno-Karabakh, as well as its military personnel. By not taking punitive actions, Armenia means that actions that seek to punish such individuals simply because they sought to represent and protect the ethnic Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh must be prescribed. We mean you cannot take actions to punish them through the denial of CERD protected rights, including the rights under Article 5B discussed by Professor Sicilianos. As we have explained, Azerbaijan has already detained at least 8 high-ranking current and former leaders of Nagorno-Karabakh, and Armenia has reason to believe that Azerbaijan has detained an unspecified number of others. Moreover, Azerbaijan has purportedly identified hundreds of other ethnic Armenians that it plans to arrest. There is, as the court is well aware, a long-standing and well-documented history of mistreatment by Azerbaijan of ethnic Armenian detainees and prisoners of war. Azerbaijan must thus be ordered to refrain from any action that targets these individuals simply based on their role as democratically elected representatives or as persons charged with the maintenance of security, and further must be ordered to respect and protect their fundamental human rights. The eighth measure we request is that Azerbaijan shall not alter or destroy any monument commemorating the 2015 Armenian genocide or any other monument or Armenian cultural artifact or site present in Nagorno-Karabakh. Despite the court's December 2021 order, Azerbaijan has continued to vandalize and destroy Armenian cultural sites in areas where Azerbaijan took control after the 2020 war. There is every reason to believe that Azerbaijan will proceed in the same way now that it has taken control of the entirety of Nagorno-Karabakh. In fact, as you heard from Mr. Martin, just 2 weeks ago, Azerbaijani military forces opened fire on the 13th century Chagatar monastery and dismantled a large Armenian cross overlooking Stepanakert. Of particular concern, as Armenia noted in its memorial, Azerbaijan does not consider any of the hundreds of ethnic Armenian cultural sites in Nagorno-Karabakh to be Armenian. As such, there is nothing suggesting that Azerbaijan will refrain from altering the character of these sites or from destroying them altogether. A court order in this regard is thus imperative to protect the remaining Armenian cultural artifacts and sites in Nagorno-Karabakh. The ninth measure that we request is that Azerbaijan give effect to and not destroy civil registers, identity documents, and property titles and registers established by the authorities of Nagorno-Karabakh. Azerbaijan has made no secret of its Great Return Plan, which seeks to resettle Azerbaijanis to the parts of Nagorno-Karabakh which is now controlled by Azerbaijan. This plan is already in motion in the places that Azerbaijan took over after the 2020 war, and there is every reason to believe that Azerbaijan will now expand it to the whole region. In pursuing this goal of resettling Azerbaijanis, Azerbaijan must ensure that it does not prevent the return of ethnic Armenians who were forced to flee their homes and businesses. Yet this would occur if Azerbaijan destroys property records and civil registers, or, as Professor Darjan will discuss, if Azerbaijan supersedes such records through some new registration process. Armenia has detailed in its memorial the difficulties ethnic Armenians have experienced historically throughout Azerbaijan in having their property rights respected. And absent court action, these same difficulties will now unfold in Nagorno-Karabakh. As previously noted, I leave our presentation on the 10th measure that Armenia requests to Professor Darjan, but I wish to stress that all of the measures we seek, all of them, are necessary notwithstanding the court's prior orders in this case. Virtually all of the measures we now request have no express analog in the December 2021 order, such as the measures we request addressing the return of ethnic Armenians to Nagorno-Karabakh, or addressing the taking into custody of high-ranking civilian leaders during this past month. Our present request concerning the protection of cultural heritage does have an express analog in the 2021 order, given that that order required Azerbaijan to take all necessary measures to prevent and punish acts of vandalism and desecration affecting Armenian cultural heritage. Our eighth request today, admittedly, essentially asks the court to reaffirm its previous order. But this is a necessary step, given that Azerbaijan has resisted the 2021 order, claiming that it does not cover any alteration or reconstruction of Armenian cultural heritage sites. They said that in a letter to you. And for the avoidance of doubt, it is important to stress that in the requested measure we bring to you today, that Azerbaijan not alter or destroy any monument commemorating the 1915 Armenian genocide, this is critical given the presence of numerous such monuments in the areas now under Azerbaijani control. And this is all the more so critical given that Azerbaijan is one of the few countries that denies the Armenian genocide and that previously destroyed Armenian monuments commemorating the genocide when it had the opportunity to do so. The new circumstances and the irreversible nature of destroying cultural heritage makes it imperative that the court issue a provisional measure on this issue. Indeed, the new circumstances that have now unfolded make imperative all the measures we request so as to clearly target and reinforce Azerbaijan's CERD obligations in the context of the present crisis. The court has viewed the existence of new circumstances to warrant issuance of new or supplementary provisional measures, as you found when issuing further measures in this case to address Azerbaijan's conduct concerning the Lachin Corridor. The context in which Armenia comes before you today is dramatically different from that which existed at the time of the court's orders in 2021 and even earlier in this year. Moreover, if Azerbaijan is to be believed when it says that no harm will come to the ethnic Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh, which this past month, some 100,000 of them have sadly and painfully demonstrated they do not believe. But if Azerbaijan truly intends them no harm, then Azerbaijan should have no concern with the court's issuance of these provisional measures. Rather, it is Azerbaijan's protestations as to such measures that vividly demonstrates why they are so desperately needed. Madam President, members of the court, my last point is that the court's issuance of these measures would not require the court to resolve any facts that would be prejudicial to decisions on jurisdiction or on the merits in this case. After you hear from Azerbaijan's counsel this afternoon, with references no doubt to the many exhibits they produced just 2 days ago, you may think that there are disputed facts that should not be resolved at this stage in the proceeding. Yet the core facts relevant to the measures that we request are not in dispute. More than 100,000 ethnic Armenians have fled Nagorno-Karabakh in fear. They are not on vacation. And there can be no dispute that they would like to be able to return to their homes and to live their lives peacefully in a land that their ancestors have indigenously occupied for millennia, if their rights and security can be assured. Armenia has demonstrated that they fled because they fear for their lives, they fear for their homes, and they fear being taken into custody. While Azerbaijan no doubt will dispute the reasons we have advanced for Azerbaijan's military actions and will deny that its conduct constitutes ethnic cleansing, there can be no dispute that more than 100,000 ethnic Armenians are currently displaced, or that still others remain highly vulnerable, and that measures must therefore be put in place to ensure respect for their rights under the CERD. Given those undisputed facts, it matters not how Azerbaijan this afternoon justifies its actions. For today, what we are facing is a massive crisis of displaced persons and other tragedies. This is precisely the type of situation where the court must issue provisional measures so as to protect an ethnic group from any further denial of their asserted rights, pending the court's disposition of this case on the merits. Madam President, that concludes my presentation. If it pleases the court, Professor Darjan will now continue Armenia's presentation.
I thank Professor Murphy, and I now invite Professor Pierre Darjan to address the court. You have the floor, Professor.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Madame la Présidente, Mesdames et Messieurs les juges, c'est toujours un honneur de prendre la parole devant la Cour au soutien de l'Arménie. Et je voudrais revenir brièvement sur 3 réalités factuelles déterminantes en l'espèce, y compris pour l'indication de la 10e et dernière mesure conservatoire sollicitée par l'Arménie. Madame la Présidente, la première réalité factuelle qu'il faut garder à l'esprit est que les réfugiés du Haut-Karabakh sont bel et bien victimes d'un nettoyage ethnique. Alors que cela plaise ou non à l'Azerbaïdjan, il n'y a pas d'autre mot pour décrire ce qui vient de se passer. L'Azerbaïdjan vous dira que les résidents arméniens du Haut-Karabakh sont partis de leur plein gré. Cette fable, mesdames et messieurs les juges, cette fable est évidemment intenable. Et même le président Aliyev s'en rend compte, ce qui l'amène à inventer une autre fable. Conformément à son habitude consistant à rejeter sa faute sur autrui, il soutient en effet désormais que, je cite un communiqué de la présidence azerbaïdjanaise relatant une conversation avec le président du Conseil européen le 7 octobre de cette année, je cite, « It was the so-called regime that had forced Armenians to leave the territory ». Madame la Présidente, Mesdames et Messieurs les juges, dans la fable du bourreau accusant sa victime d'être responsable de ses propres souffrances, il est difficile d'être plus abject. Mais il est toutefois probable que vous devrez souffrir à nouveau cette nouvelle fable tout à l'heure. Heureusement, comme le professeur Murphy vient de l'expliquer, vous n'avez pas à statuer maintenant sur le fond à cet égard, mais cette réalité ne peut pour autant pas être ignorée à ce stade conservatoire. La deuxième réalité qu'il faut garder à l'esprit saute également aux yeux. L'Azerbaïdjan fait tout pour que la situation actuelle perdure, c'est-à-dire qu'il cherche à consolider son nettoyage ethnique. Le lendemain de l'attaque massive du 19 septembre, le président Aliyev proclama « Azerbaijan regained its sovereignty ». Et au même moment, le Haut-Karabakh se vidait de ses habitants et le président Aliyev vantait leur prétendue liberté de partir. Depuis, comme en 2020, l'Azerbaïdjan a commencé à mettre en œuvre son plan du grand retour. Cela est profondément choquant. Lors d'un premier recensement en 1886, le Haut-Karabakh était peuplé à 85% d'Arméniens. À l'époque de la création de l'oblast soviétique, ce pourcentage était de plus de 89%. À la fin de l'époque soviétique, il y avait encore quelques 77% d'Arméniens au Haut-Karabakh. Et comme vous le savez, il n'y en a plus que quelques poignées aujourd'hui. Appliqué au Haut-Karabakh, le prétendu grand retour des Azerbaïdjanais est purement et simplement un projet d'exclusion contraire à la Convention. Il consiste à remplacer les Arméniens déracinés de leurs terres ancestrales, où ils ont toujours été très largement majoritaires, par des Azerbaïdjanais. L'Azerbaïdjan n'attend qu'une chose, mesdames et messieurs les juges, que la Cour ne soit pas un obstacle à la consolidation de son grand projet discriminatoire mené sous couvert de souveraineté territoriale. Ce projet passe non seulement par le nettoyage ethnique auquel le monde vient d'assister, mais aussi par la négation et l'altération du caractère arménien des villes, des villages, des monuments, des églises et de tous les artefacts culturels arméniens. Mesdames et messieurs les juges, pensez-vous que détruire à Chouchi le monument commémorant le génocide arménien de 1915 et le remplacer par le drapeau azerbaïdjanais aussitôt cette ville prétendument libérée, pensez-vous que cela constitue seulement une faute de goût? Pensez-vous que ce qui a été fait à Chouchi au début de 2021 et dont je vous avais rapporté les faits lors de la première demande de mesures conservatoires de l'Arménie, pensez-vous que cela est exceptionnel, fortuit? Pensez-vous que ça ne se répétera pas ailleurs au Haut-Karabakh, alors que le régime de Bakou, on le sait, nie en bloc l'existence du génocide arménien? Pensez-vous que plus récemment, l'abattage de la Grande Croix surplombant Stepanakert ou le fait de mitrailler un monastère arménien du XIIIe siècle relève d'une bien regrettable insensibilité culturelle de la soldatesque enivrée de victoire? Pensez-vous que lorsque le ministère azerbaïdjanais de la Culture soutient ce 4 octobre que le monastère de Ganjazar aurait été fondé par les Albanais caucasiens, puis falsifié par les Arméniens durant leur occupation du Haut-Karabakh, pensez-vous que cela relève d'une erreur archéologique d'un stagiaire débutant?
Turn? Of course not. This is not just fortuitous. This is not just a blunder. All this was clearly calculated, carefully thought through, and meticulously and progressively orchestrated with the sole purpose of consolidating ethnic cleansing plans in Nagorno-Karabakh and making it clear to Armenians once and for all that they were unwelcome there. President Aliyev's diplomatic advisor recently claimed, and I quote,
C'est sur votre écran. We are deliberately refraining from putting up Azerbaijani flags. We know that there are still civilians and we know their fears.
Isn't that a wonderful testament to the fact that ethnic Armenians from Nagorno-Karabakh indeed fear Azerbaijanis, including those who have remained there? But that is not it. This admission contains a lie, as the footage on the screen shows. Since the 19th of September, Azerbaijan adores placing its flag in Nagorno-Karabakh. And there's more still. In a letter addressed to the European Court of Human Rights on the 2nd of October that we have submitted as Appendix 140, and knowing that the presidential advisor was talking nonsense, Azerbaijan amended its statement, even while quoting it, so as to restrict its scope, or even at least attempt to restrict its scope in Stepanakert. That was renamed Chekindi. Not only did Azerbaijan try to deceive the court in Strasbourg, but it lied once again because, as you can see on the screen, Azerbaijan's flag was even placed on the most symbolic monument of the capital of Nagorno-Karabakh. Distinguished members of the court, the protection of the rights enshrined in the Convention requires that Armenian heritage in Nagorno-Karabakh be preserved, and Armenia requests the court to ensure the legal conditions for the safe return of ethnic Armenians to their ancestral homeland. These conditions are set out in the provisional measures that Professor Murphy detailed.
Armenia believes that it is particularly well placed to understand the need for security of the traumatized refugees from Nagorno-Karabakh and to know what measures are necessary to ensure their effective return. In this respect, the measures requested are also intended to anticipate all the tricks Azerbaijan is capable of pulling to prevent this return, including the pretext that the refugees' identity or property titles are non-existent since they were issued by the authorities of the so-called regime that Azerbaijan considers illegal, and that consequently, in the absence of a valid proof, the said refugees have no right to return to their homes. I would also like to remind you that, as the recent past has taught us, any measure requested by Armenia that you do not indicate will be celebrated by Azerbaijan as a go-ahead from your part. Azerbaijan will read your order as a alleged rejection of such and such Armenian requests, and therefore as an encouragement to do what the measure was intended to avoid, even though the measure actually ordered by the court, read and executed in good faith, necessarily but not implicitly prohibits the same conduct. Thus, if you indicate ambiguous measures whose loopholes Baku will exploit, ethnic cleansing will come to pass. Furthermore, distinguished members of the court, if you wait until you've ruled on the merits to thwart the ongoing plans of ethnic cleansing on the pretext that this is a request for restitution, which our opponents might argue through legal subterfuge, it will be too late. Madam President, I'm coming to the third factual reality that must be borne in mind when ruling. It concerns the promises and assurances presented by Azerbaijan in an attempt to convince you that there is no need to indicate provisional measures. The first reason why Azerbaijan cannot be taken at its word is that its word alone is incapable of ensuring the return of traumatized refugees in Nagorno-Karabakh. If you think that this word is enough, you will have made an unfortunate contribution to President Aliyev's great work. The second reason why Azerbaijan's word cannot be trusted is because its word is totally inadequate and that what it says does not really commit it to anything. Let's take a closer look at Azerbaijan's so-called commitments. Do they concern the safety of Armenian political prisoners and the few dozen Armenians who remain in Nagorno-Karabakh? Not a word. Do they concern the preservation of the Armenian character of Nagorno-Karabakh? Not a word on this issue. Does Azerbaijan promise not to flood Nagorno-Karabakh with Azerbaijans? Not a word in this regard. On the contrary, the hastening of the Great Return has been announced. Finally, with regard to the return of this time of Armenian refugees, Azerbaijan wrote in the following letter to you on the 2nd of October.
That Armenian residents of Karabakh who decide to leave will have a right to return to Karabakh. Les mots employés.
The words used and the conjugation of the verbs in the sentence are obviously important on the 2nd of October when Nagorno-Karabakh was almost emptied of its inhabitants. Azerbaijan claims to guarantee that the few Armenian residents of Karabakh who decided to leave their homeland will have a right to return. There's all there is to it. Is this an unconditional and secure guarantee of the right to return for all those who fled their homes on the 19th of September? Not at all. And Azerbaijan is well aware of this, as it never chooses its words at random. Similarly, the reintegration procedure proposed for the Armenian residents of Nagorno-Karabakh, which
in the Karabakh region. Azerbaijan
they say that this maintains that this registration procedure is purely voluntary, but the document it has submitted to you indicate that this registration is.
Et puis ça veut dire.
And what does that mean? Reintegration of Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh who are still there, and above all, how does this registration procedure, with a view to reintegration, enables the return of refugees who are now in Armenia, or the protection of rights, particularly property titles of those who decide not to return? In particular, the 9th protective measure requested by Armenia is in no way superseded by this registration procedure. In fact, after presenting the registration as voluntary, Azerbaijan would have no problem considering unregistered places of residence and property titles as voluntarily abandoned, and therefore at the disposal of the Azerbaijanis. Whatever is said, all will be said to later. Azerbaijan cannot be taken at its word. With regard to this dispute, one only needs to recall the many statements made to you by the agent of Azerbaijan, which was contradicted by facts, as the agent of Armenia recalled at the beginning of the hearing. Moreover, you have considered Azerbaijani statements made at this hearing to be insufficient to completely eliminate the risk of irreparable harm. The same is even more true here. Madam President, distinguished members of the court, all this leads Armenia to ask you to order the 10th provisional measure requested as well, namely to require Azerbaijan to report regularly on the implementation of your future order. And of course, Armenia is well aware that in December 2021, you considered such a request was not justified in the particular circumstances of the case. Since then, however, Azerbaijan, as you know, on several occasions, has defied your authority. And may I remind you that it considers that your order of 6 July validated its checkpoint, closing the Latrin corridor, which is quite incredible. Above all, since then, the particular circumstances of the case have completely changed. Madam President, if you wish to reassure the Armenian men and women who fled their homelands, you must require Azerbaijan, pursuant to Rule 78 of the Rules of Procedure, to report regularly to you on the implementation of your future order. In the same way, it required Myanmar to do so. The gravity of the situation, what is at stake in your future order, and the preservation of your authority require this. Moreover, Armenia, as you know, has been obliged to alert the court every time Azerbaijan has taken initiatives contrary to its international obligations, and this has led to bitter exchanges that have worn out Armenia, and no doubt the court, we therefore believe that such a measure will also contribute to the proper administration of justice. Madam President, distinguished members of the court, thank you for your attention. May I ask you, Madam President, to kindly invite the agent of Armenia, Dr. Karasko, to present his country's final submissions.
I thank Professor Darjan for his statement, and I now invite the agent of Armenia, His Excellency Mr. Yigeshi Kirokiasyan, to take the floor. You have the floor, Excellency.
Madam President, distinguished judges of the court, it is an honor to appear before you again. I shall now read Armenia's closing submissions. On the basis of the request for provisional measures dated 28 September 2023 and its oral pleadings, Armenia respectfully requests the court to indicate the following provisional measures pending its determination of the case on merits. First, Azerbaijan should refrain from taking any measures which might entail breaches of its obligation under the CERD. Second, Azerbaijan should refrain from taking any actions directly or indirectly aimed at or having the effect of displacing the remaining ethnic Armenians from Nagorno-Karabakh or preventing the safe and expeditious return to their homes of persons displaced in the course of the recent military attack, including those who have fled to Armenia or third states, while permitting those who wish to leave Nagorno-Karabakh to do so without any hindrance. Third, Azerbaijan shall withdraw all military and law enforcement personnel from all civilian establishment in Nagorno-Karabakh occupied as a result of its armed attack on 19 September 2023. Fourth, Azerbaijan shall facilitate and refrain from placing any impediment on the access of the United Nations and its specialized agencies to the ethnic Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh and shall not interfere with their activities in any way. Fifth, Azerbaijan shall facilitate and refrain from placing any impediment on the ability of the International Committee of the Red Cross to provide humanitarian aid to the ethnic Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh, and shall cooperate with the International Committee of the Red Cross to address the other consequences of the recent conflict. Sixth, Azerbaijan shall immediately facilitate the full restoration of public utilities, including gas and electricity, to Nagorno-Karabakh, and shall refrain from disrupting them in the future. Seventh, Azerbaijan shall refrain from taking punitive actions against the current or former political representatives or military personnel of Nagorno-Karabakh. Eighth, Azerbaijan shall not alter or destroy any monument commemorating 1915 Armenian genocide or any other monument or Armenian cultural artifact or site present in Nagorno-Karabakh. Ninth, Azerbaijan shall recognize and give effect to civil registers, identity documents, and property titles and registers established by the authorities of Nagorno-Karabakh, and shall not destroy or confiscate such registers and documents. 10th, Azerbaijan shall submit a report to the court on all measures taken to give effect to this order within 1 month as from the date of this order, and thereafter every 3 months until a final decision on the case is rendered by the court. Madam President, distinguished judges of the court, this concludes Armenia's oral presentation of its request for provisional measures. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the judges and the registry for accommodating Armenian delegation here at the Peace Palace and for promptly organizing this hearing. I would like to thank in particular the registry staff and the interpreters for ensuring the hearing's smooth conduct. Thank you for your attention and for your consideration of Armenia's request.
I thank the agent of Armenia, whose statement brings to an end this single round of oral argument of Armenia, as well as this morning's sitting. The court will meet again this afternoon at 4 p.m. to hear Azerbaijan present its single round of oral argument. The sitting is adjourned.